Welcome to the Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is my regular co-host, Cleveland area attorney and Republican factotum, Jay Carson.
Good morning, Mike.
Good morning, Jay. How are you today?
Oh, I'm pretty good.
Yeah, well, me too. We have a lot to talk about today, so why don't we just get right to it? Starting with some of the more important results from the latest round of primary elections, which took place this week. On Tuesday, we had primaries in, let's see here, Vermont, Connecticut, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And, there were a couple of things, Jay, that jumped out at me. First off, in Vermont, the Democratic nominee, Christine Hallquist, became the first transgender person in U.S. history to be nominated for governor by a major party. And she's a former energy company executive. The Hallquist has I would say, definitely an uphill battle against the Republican incumbent, Governor Phil Scott. And there are some Democrats, of course, that are hoping that Scott's, his poll numbers have been sort of, support been kind of lukewarm. But honestly, I think that this is pretty much still a solid Republican state, and I don't think that Hallquist has that much of a chance. Do you have any, thoughts on the fact that Hallquist was nominated in the first place?
Well, I don't know, and I don't want to, I don't want to. I guess because look, I'm not someone who has been watching the race closely for any period of time. So I'm hoping it's not just a tokenism sort of thing of, hey, we want to have the first transgender gubernatorial candidate. I don't know. I mean, so I guess I don't know enough about her to really give a good comment on the merits. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to her opponent. I guess it would be much more surprising, I think, if a transgender person were to win a Republican primary.
Yeah.
But so it's yeah. I mean, I'm not sure to read any more into that than that the fact that the transgender piece I think would play well to the progressive base, and that may have helped.
Sure.
So.
And I think also that certainly it plays well the progressive base, as you point out, but I think also that somebody with that experience, I mean, I won't say it's a unique experience, but it's an experience certainly that is, I think, difficult for those of us who are not transgendered to appreciate. And so I think that Hallquist brings something, just having lived that experience, that could potentially on some issues be valuable.
I suppose, and I should because I don't think we ever talked about this, but I have a friend of mine who recently is transitioning, and it's again it's a it's a something that I have never dealt with as far as someone personally who I knew, and it's I'm trying to even think of the exact words for it, but again, it is a thing of I don't really have any context to put that into, and I suppose if you've got a candidate who runs as a transgender person and sort of would bring that context or bring that experience to a lot of people, I think that's probably a good thing in general. Although, I don't know. Look, at the job of governor, a lot of it comes down to what are the priorities in the state budget. I don't know that your gender or your previous gender or transitioning stage really has much to do with those, basic governing questions.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I would imagine Hallquist's experience as a top executive at a big company would be
the business thing would go a lot farther. Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I mean, there was kind of a more general theme of diversity, at least to a certain extent, on the Democratic side. I mean, it showed up in, for instance, the primary for Minnesota's 5th Congressional District. Voters nominated Ilhan Omar, who's a former Somali refugee. In fact, in 2016, she became the first Somali American to win elective office in the entire United States in a state house seat. And now this is unlike Vermont, this is a heavily Democratic district, and so she's almost assured of being the
Right.
first Somali American who'll be elected to Congress. And also, I should mention Connecticut. Johanna Hayes, she was nominated by Democrats for their 5th congressional district, and this is another strong Democratic district. Hayes is likely to become Connecticut's first African American woman member of Congress. She was also, I should mention, the 2016 National Teacher of the Year. And as you might expect, and I don't mean this as a dig, it's going to sound that way. Maybe before I said it, I realized. So I just wanted to preface this, but to run against Omar and Hayes, the Republicans nominated, two white people. And so, I wanted to, well, no, but I mean, seriously,
Come on, man.
but no, it's, we see a
No,
lot of.
I necessarily, okay, but go ahead.
But no, I mean, the point I'm making here is we see a lot of this diversity in a lot of ways in the Democratic coalition, and we don't see as much of it in the Republican coalition, and that's just a fact. Now, to the extent to which that fact matters, that's certainly open to debate, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I think look, I think diversity is fantastic, and quite honestly, in Republican circles, it's been my experience when there's the opportunity to promote a candidate of color or a candidate of different ethnicity, children of immigrants, and I'm thinking of Tim Scott, Nikki Haley. The congresswoman from I apologize, I'm losing the state, from Salt Lake City. Again, Republicans very much want to do that. The difficulty is that the polls tend to show it. It's not a matter that Republicans don't like minorities. It's sort of minorities don't like Republicans is what the the polls tend to show.
It becomes a chicken and egg kind of thing, obviously, because a lot of minorities, and whether you agree with this or not, feel that Republican policies do not work for them in the way
Sure.
that Democratic policies do.
Sure, and they'd be incorrect, of course, I'd argue, but
yeah.
But regardless, that's the perception, and it's played upon. So to some extent, sometimes these diversity issues are going to be creatures of the district. Now, obviously, you don't get something like that in Vermont, but that is the case in say, Minnesota. I don't know that the Democrats do well necessarily running on a diversity. I guess always nominating the non-white candidate. I think you run the best candidate for the race, regardless, and sometimes that's going to be someone of color or someone of a different heritage than you typically see, and sometimes it's not. So I think that there tends to be sort of a fetishism on the left with diversity that I think can be counterproductive, and we'll see how that plays out. And again, some of these races, it's not going to make a difference because it's a solid Democrat seat. In some cases, like Vermont, I don't think it's going to make a difference, not because there's going to be some big wave of anti-transgender people who come out to vote, but because, look, you've got an incumbent who's got a pretty solid record and is pretty well liked, and that would be an uphill battle for anyone.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like fundamentally you and I don't disagree here that that on the margins, having more diverse candidates is a good thing. But of course, the most important thing is sort of the basic qualifications to succeed in the office, essentially, and diversity can add something to the picture, something valuable. But the most important thing is, can this person do the things like you point out, the budget and be an effective legislator or that sort of thing.
Well, it's also the ideas that they bring to office that they're campaigning on. It's their background, and it's also what they want to do.
Sure. And of course, just like as you point out, and I think fairly, that on the left there are people who some who raise diversity as perhaps more important than it should be. I mean, on the right there are people who actively push back against diversity, and we don't really support either of those. Personally,
No,
we don't support
no.
either of those approaches.
And I would just say again, when you say on the right, I mean, I think you're talking the broader right. I mean, the Republican Party, as I've become familiar with it, certainly isn't like that. Like I said, I think anytime, I mean, if you look, it's I'm thinking back Ohio political history. Republicans nominated Ken Blackwell, a black man, to run for governor. He lost miserably, but again, I don't think that had anything to do with
Right.
his race. I think it was just a tough year for Republicans, and he was actually he beat out Jim Petro, who had been the more establishment candidate, if you will. So what I'm saying is I think there's evidence in a lot of places that Republican voters um, aren't opposed to diversity, and in fact will nominate people of color, particularly if they're people of color who agree with them ideologically. And I think that's overall it's a good thing, because it eventually, it's a antidote to some extent to identity politics.
Sure. And
It
certainly,
sort of says that anyone of a certain race or a certain color or a certain background must think the same way.
yeah, and that's the Republican Party that I used to be
Yeah.
a member of, and I know that's your Republican Party. I would argue that increasingly that is not the Republican Party of Donald Trump, and that's maybe a different discussion, though.
Right.
So, one race in which diversity doesn't play much of an issue at all is Wisconsin. The Republican incumbent, of course, is Scott Walker, who, if you recall back,
The
and I'm
most
sure
elected governor.
yeah, and he was actually thought of as one of the, back in 2015 and early 2016, as one of the strongest potential Republican presidential candidates, in part thanks to his very strong fight against the unions in his state. But he flamed out really quickly in 2016. Well, he's running again. He's going to be running against Democrat Tony Evers. Now, I should point out, Democrats have come close to defeating Walker, both in 2012 and 2014, though close obviously isn't good enough. And there are some who think that, well, they've inched closer every time, and this could be the year, and a year that looks really good for Democrats so far, though I'd say my sense of it is that Evers is still a slight underdog in this race, though it's going to be, I think, a pretty close one. What do you think, Jay? Do you think this is going to be the year that the Democrats finally give Walker the boot, or does he have a couple more years in him?
Well, I'll tell you, I think it as you sort of alluded to, it's going to come down to turnout. My sense is that they're not going to get that turnout that they want or need, given that, consider the last election was very much, I mean, there was a recall election. I mean, so pretty much everyone who was mad or disliked Scott Walker, they got him out. And at that point, that anger was much more palpable, and the things were still in progress and so forth. So I think Walker wins, but again, if it should turn out to be some sort of a Democrat blue wave type election with massive Democrat turnout, that's what would make the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And one more election I wanted to talk about before we move on is Kansas's primary elections. They weren't this last week; they were the week before. But the race for the Republican gubernatorial nomination was so close that it took until this week for one of the candidates, one of the nominees to concede. And this was a big victory for the Trump wing of the party, because Kansas Secretary of State Chris Colbeck just squeaked by the much more moderate Republican incumbent, who's the current governor, Jeff Collier. Now, Colbeck, of course, is an immigration hardliner. He was a member of Donald Trump's transition team. He's the guy who led that so-called vote fraud panel that President Trump put together. And so this is a Trump guy, a strong Trump guy, and Colbeck will be running against Democrat Laura Kelly, who's a member of Kansas's state Senate. Now, according to the Cook Political Report, which is sort of my go-to source for these things, they rate this race as a toss-up. And I think, given what I expect to see from Democrats in the fall, I think Republicans really hurt themselves potentially by nominating Colbeck over Collier. But we shall see. What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, it's going to. It's sort of a funny thing now. Again, across the board, Democrats are going to run that. Every Republican is a ally of Donald Trump, and I would imagine show sort of the split screen sort of Donald Trump's policies and so forth. But with some people, it might stick more than others. In this case, I could see those allegations really sticking. But we'll see. How much did Trump win Iowa by?
Iowa, I don't recall.
So I mean, I'll be just curious to see the fall off of if it's consistent or if it's the same. So again, that's going to come down turnout wise. I think Democrats are going to be as energized as they can be, and I think to some extent Republicans, a lot of them will vote the party line. And then you've got the Trump Republicans, who many were not really in the party before. They were independents or just sort of non-voters. Will vote for the Trump candidate. So I think it sort of balances out a little bit. I mean, there's the Democratic anger, but there's some balancing. I don't see many Republicans. And again, every gubernatorial election, every district election comes down to that district and that district's issues. So it's tough to. I'm not a big believer in big wave type things. Sometimes they happen, but I think sometimes people read waves where there aren't.
Well,
sometimes groups just have one candidate is better than the other.
I think you're whistling past the graveyard on this one, but I would be too, probably in your position. I expect, but then again, it might be wishful thinking on my part. But one of us will be more right on this, and we will know in a few months here, actually. So it's coming up quicker than you might think. So I want to move on and talk about another big story this week. President Trump followed through on his earlier threats to take the fairly unprecedented step of pulling the security clearances of his critics. Now this week, it was former CIA Director John Brennan, though the administration has named other former government officials that they're considering acting against. And these include former CIA Director Michael Hayden, former NSA or National Security Advisor Susan Rice, former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, and former Acting Attorney General Sally Yates, and there are a few others in there as well. Now, in the statement from the president that Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders read, according to this statement, Brennan's clearance was pulled due to his making a series of unfounded and outrageous allegations, wild outbursts on the internet and television about this administration, and also that any benefits that senior officials might glean from consultations with Mr. Brennan are now outweighed by the risk posed by his erratic conduct and behavior. Mr. Brennan has a history that calls into question his objectivity and credibility. And I read that statement and I thought, wow, Donald Trump is saying this about somebody. Well, I guess he would be the one to know about wild outbursts and questions about his objectivity and credibility and erratic conduct and behavior. I mean, that was my first comment. Just, wow, that's about as shameless as it gets. I guess I don't know. I'm sure,
but it doesn't mean that he's wrong.
Go ahead, expand on that.
Well, I mean, I think, obviously Trump does all sorts of erratic, crazy sort of things and shameless behavior. There's no question about that. But he's also the elected president. So that's sort of it. It comes with the job. In the other case, you're talking about someone who is a former administrative employee of the government. And is saying things that I think it's sort of troubling when you have the former CIA director who will make accusations again that there is collusion and so forth, but not offer proof. I think that's an issue. Now, setting aside the idea that what Trump did was stupid and petty, I don't think is there really any danger? Does it outweigh his consultation with current government folks outweigh any problem, any
value you could give?
Value. I mean, I doubt it. And in most cases, when folks retain security clearances and they're renewed, I believe, like every 5 years, It's usually for the purpose of they're doing other contracting or they're sitting on boards. Um, so I
Well, and I
so
should.
to me, look, it came out as this is a dumb, petty, stupid Trumpian thing to do. Is he authorized to do it? Absolutely.
Well, I think there's more than that. I should follow up by saying, of course, Brennan responded. He had the big op-ed in the New York Times where he said that the president's claims of no collusion were, in his words, hogwash, and he basically painted Trump as this increasingly desperate guy. In light of the Mueller investigation, maybe moving into its final stages. And then the president talks to a Wall Street Journal reporter and says about this whole thing, saying, these people led it, meaning the Russia investigation. So I think it's something that had to be done, meaning pulling security clearances. And then finally, and this to me is the most troubling aspect, there's a senior White House official was cited by the Washington Post, and this was on late Friday, and we're recording this Saturday morning. Sarah Huckabee Sanders and the deputy chief of staff of the White House, Bill Shine, they've actually supposedly discussed what times would be best to announce already planned additional security clearance revocations in order to deflect from unfavorable news events. And so, I mean, what we have here, I think, is more than just Trump being petty and vindictive. That's certainly that. But it's actually using security clearances as a political weapon. And, I immediately thought of Richard Nixon using the IRS as a political weapon against his opponents. And there was this week a great article from David French in National Review about his argument that this is a legitimate constitutional concern. And, certainly there's no right to a security clearance. But his argument,
what I was going to say.
Right, but his argument was that keeping it shouldn't be a reward for good political behavior, and private citizens shouldn't be essentially subject to retaliation for exercising their First Amendment rights. And I think, that French is really onto something here. And this isn't some, wacko liberal. This is, right. Somebody coming from the right. Yeah, and so that's the thing that concerns me is that this is something that really we haven't seen before. And I just tend to think, and this goes back to my general theme about Donald Trump, is that he doesn't really care about the country or security or anything about that. His primary and fundamental and almost sole focus is what's best for Donald Trump. And I think that represents a real break from almost any other president that we can think of. And I think it's a fairly, it's a tragic thing for the country.
Yeah. No, and I'll say I usually agree with David French. I don't in this instance. I think what Trump is doing is he's practicing politics. Look, the government gives certain benefits to folks. One of those would be like a security clearance, but it's also the government's or the president, the executive branch's discretion to get rid of that. Now, if he's doing that for a stupid, petty reason, he should be called out on that. But I don't think this raises to any sort of constitutional issue other than, look, all that's how politics works, is it's carrots and sticks. And fortunately in our system, the carrots and sticks are it's not a matter of someone losing their liberty, someone being locked up or something if you're an opponent. But you may not get some of the perks that you would have otherwise. So,
I think something that I'm fairly certain you and I both agree on is there is the law, which is obviously hugely important. Then there is the unwritten law. And this is a kind of a more sort of Burkean sort of idea.
I like the unwritten law. Yep.
And the unwritten law is really our sort of understanding of it and our willing to adhere to it is kind of what keeps us together. Because if we just go by the letter of the law, things fall apart. And I think the problem is when you get someone like Donald Trump, who I would say is a man of no virtue and no honor and no decency, who doesn't give a rip for the unwritten law, you start to see problems with the system. And we need enough people in the system who care about that unwritten law and where things like virtue and honor and duty matter to them, or else the whole thing falls apart.
Right. No, and you're exactly right on that. But I would disagree with the idea that, again, it poses some sort of constitutional capital C problem for a president to do this. I am all for it, I guess, and I think that's a great thing. And so often we talk about Burkeanism. The way it works is it's sort of a soft power, it's soft pushback. it is so many other people saying, "Oh, come on, this is ridiculous." And so it's I think that'll work itself out, and I think that's happening. There will be plenty of people on both sides, and again, this is David French coming from the right, saying that this is just inappropriate, and it's again to me petty, vindictive, unpresidential, doesn't do much to move the ball forward on any policy. Um,
Well,
you know,
yeah, well, we'll see what happens.
front.
I mean, I think part of the
But again, it's part of politics is anytime you're doing something, you're going to have enemies, and they're carrots and sticks, and he's using this one, which is again most historic. It's a little bit like it's like throwing at a batter's head a little bit, right?
well,
It's
yeah,
you're
yes
not
and
it's
no, because if you do that, then there's
again that yeah
retaliation. But
there's a law. Let's maybe throwing inside. How
well,
about that?
well, this brings me back to one of the you and I are old enough to remember this. One of George H.W. Bush's favorite words that he was mocked for, I think, to a certain extent, was prudence, and he would say it wouldn't be prudent. And that idea of prudence and kind of the related idea of temperance, I think, especially in a leader, especially in the supreme leader, if you will, is is
Calling you supreme
well,
leader.
is far more important than in any other position because people are in less of a position to push back. And so if those norms of virtue, duty, and honor aren't already present in that person can do a lot of damage to the democratic order while not violating a single law. And I
Yeah,
think that's
it does damage to the um, um, I'm trying to think the best way that to the character of the organization,
yeah.
if you will, the culture, and that as you erode that culture, you lose something. Um, so yeah, so I don't think we disagree. The only point I disagree on is that there was any legal remedy or anything like that to this, or
No, I don't think
that they somehow exceeded
yeah.
his constitutional powers in doing that.
No,
Or
I don't
doing
think we disagree on that either, actually. So we're actually sort of in agreement entirely on this, I think. So go figure. But, I also wanted to mention a related story. The FBI fired Agent Peter Strzok, who, of course, was the guy who helped lead the Bureau's investigation into Russian interference. That is until those
and also the Hillary Clinton emails.
and the Hillary Clinton emails. Yep, he was only on the Russia
Busy guy.
team. Yeah, until those anti-Trump texts he sent to fellow agent Lisa Page, who he was having an affair with. Those were revealed, and then Robert Mueller immediately removed him from the team there. Now, the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility recommended that Strzok be demoted and put on a 60-day suspension, but that was overruled by Deputy Director David Bowditch, who ordered the firing. So I was wondering, Jay, what do you think? Did Bowditch make the right call in overruling the OPR and firing Strzok?
Yes, I think he did. There's a lot that needs to be done to sort of rehabilitate the FBI, and again, we were just talking about, I guess, sort of safeguarding institutions and then the character and culture of institutions. To me, it's not even so much the anti-Trump stuff that he texted, but sort of the anti-Trump supporter stuff. Again, he's at a Walmart in Southern Virginia, and you could smell the Trumps. That's this really disdain for the country and the people he's supposed to be serving. If anyone in a corporate position had done those sort of things, I think they would be dismissed immediately. Certainly much sooner than Strzok was. And also, again, the credibility of the and what he's done, rightly or wrongly, from an FBI perspective, I think they ought to be angry at him because his tweets have called into question the credibility and the fairness of the investigation.
Yeah.
It's sort of if you go back to like the Mark Furman and OJ sort of thing. Furman made some really dumb things, had done some dumb things in the past, had a history of some racial animus and so forth. And as a result, the defense was able to play that up, and OJ walked. it's the same sort of thing. If I'm the FBI and I've got a guy out there who is sending these texts that would do anything to undermine, what was, they're saying a valid investigation, he's got to go.
I agree with you and I don't. Well, maybe I don't know. That's kind of a very academic-y sort of way to put it. But I think both sides here, both the Office of Professional Responsibility and the Deputy Director made the right call. I think inside the FBI, in that office, they need to make their decision based on the merits of the case and not looking at the politics. So I think that's their job, and they did that job. And if you just take away all the other context, I think that their recommendation was entirely appropriate. But then it's, of course, up to the people who are, running the agency and have to take the politics into account to weigh those factors and make the decision. And so, I think that the Deputy Director Bowditch did the right thing in this case, and so
that's really insightful of you.
Thank you. Every once in a while,
and you're right. No, I mean, no, because I think that's exactly right. No, the Office of Professional Responsibility had to look at this purely on the objective piece of this, not taking into account the optics. But the senior management has to look at the bigger picture. If this had been some other agent investigating a bank robbery in Des Moines, I don't think it would have been the same situation. But because these actions called into question the integrity of the Bureau from a political standpoint as a whole, and impacting elections and so forth, this step had to be taken.
Right. There you go. We're being very agreeable on a lot of this stuff today. How about that? Before we get to the next story, which we may or may not agree on, we would like to thank our newest supporter, and that's Rolf, who's our latest sustaining monthly supporter on Patreon. So thank you. Yeah, we really appreciate it. And Rolf, like everyone else who becomes a supporter of the show, it's not only, like I said, that warm, fuzzy feeling you get by knowing that you're helping us keep us going, but you also get access to our special supporters only after show. Last week, Trey and I on the show talked about the political and legal issues kind of surrounding Robert Mueller's now 8-month-long attempt to interview President Trump, as well as our thoughts on many social media and podcast outlets removing Alex Jones's InfoWars content. And this week, Jay and I have some good stuff lined up for you as well. So if you want to do that, just go ahead and go to politicsguys.com/support. That's the direct link, or just go to politicsguys.com and kind of, nose around there. You'll see the support thing on the menu or the Patreon or PayPal links, and click on those and you're all set. So thank you very much. We really do appreciate it. Okay, moving on. Some extraordinarily disturbing news, really sickening news, came out of a Pennsylvania grand jury this week. Of course, I'm talking about the massive report detailing allegations of widespread sexual abuse of at least 1,000 victims by around 300 sexual predator priests. Now, it's believed that the actual numbers are most likely considerably higher than that, but really a culture of denial and cover-up within the church has made it pretty difficult to know just how many predators and victims there really are out there. There are going to be almost no prosecutions coming out of this because in almost all of these instances, the statute of limitations has run out, and under current Pennsylvania law, victims of child sexual abuse have until the age of 30 to file civil suits and until they're 50 to file criminal charges. And Jay, I'm sure you remember the scandal that the church faced that was very similar to this in 2002.
Boston.
Yeah, the Boston Globe did this big expose, and they uncovered a similar thing. And after that, the church instituted some major reforms in how they handled abuse. And the grand jury actually addressed this, and they said, well, these reforms have been a step in the right direction, but a lot more needs to be done. Now, a couple of days after the report was released, the Vatican issued a public statement calling the abuse criminally and morally reprehensible and pledging the victims that the Pope is on their side. The statement further read that the church must learn hard lessons from its past, and there should be accountability for both abusers and those who permitted abuse to occur. But that said, a lot of people who are sort of speaking for or defending the church, what they're regularly pointing out here in this case is that almost none of the alleged cases of sexual abuse identified in the report took place after these 2002 reforms. And so they're arguing that additional action isn't necessarily called for, which is, a position that a lot of people...
They could be right.
Yeah, Well, in Pennsylvania, there's a state rep, Mark Rossi. He said he alleges he was raped by a Catholic priest as a child, and he plans to propose a law that would eliminate the statute of limitations for child sexual abuse. And he calls those limits at till 30 or 50 archaic and arbitrary. And there are also calls to implement the grand jury's most, what I would say is the grand jury's most controversial proposal, and that is to open up a 2-year so-called civil window in the existing statute of limitations, and that would allow victims over the age of 30 to sue the church for damages. And there have actually been similar proposals along these lines in other states in the past. And as best I can tell, all of them have gone down to defeat after some pretty fierce lobbying by the Catholic Church. And their argument here is that this would open up dioceses to really financial catastrophe and possible bankruptcy. And that's, exactly what happened to, for instance, the Diocese of Wilmington in 2009 after they just had a flood of abuse suits. And I should point out that in terms of the Catholic Church's organization, that from a legal standpoint, they're organized into dioceses. And so that, I think, if I understand it correctly, limits the church's overall liability for these things.
You can't sue the Pope,
exactly, that sort of thing. So, Jay, I wanted to get your thoughts on this. I mean, I'm sure I know how you feel about the abuses themselves, but what about these legislative proposals, which I think are kind of more, kind of broadly American politics based, because they would affect more than just the church, because obviously you can't craft a proposal that just targets a particular religion. That's that's a First Amendment kind of thing. But what do you think about that?
I think it's really problematic in that one of the hallmarks that we rely on and the rule of law. And this goes to individuals, institutions, government institutions, is certainty that things can be settled, and once they are settled, they're done and over. So the idea that you could retroactively, after statute of limitations has passed, rewrite it and litigate things that were not brought, that's truly a problem, I think, for Beercon. I understand the idea of, well, the victims ought to get recompense for what they've been through, but there's a system in place, and if you want to change that system going forward, I think there's some good arguments on both sides of that. But I'm not. That just kind of, I bristle at the idea of saying, okay, well, this statute of limitation is passed. Well, until we change our mind, that gets into just a, I'm not a big fan of slippery slope arguments, but this slope is pretty slippery.
So you think it feels kind of like an ex post facto sort of type of thing, basically?
And I'd say it's not exactly an ex post facto law, but it's close to
enough,
it. So that same spirit, yeah.
Well,
I could see that there would be constitutional challenges. I don't know that in the civil realm, I don't know that there would be a constitutional issue on that.
Yeah, it's a good point.
There might be state constitutional issues. In the criminal context, I think there definitely would be a constitutional issue.
Yeah, that's a great point. I had right when you started saying that, I was like, oh yeah, that seems, maybe that's why they talked about opening up that window just for civil and not for criminal prosecutions. Now, and I get that, but of course, it's so difficult to say to, victims of any sort of abuse or crime, but particularly the sort of just heinous sort of stuff. And I don't know if you read any of the report, but some of this stuff would literally sicken you. It did to me. And just to say to those people, sorry, you're 31, you're out of luck, buddy.
Yeah.
That's just a bitter pill to swallow, to say the least. And
but by the same token, I mean, also consider there's what's called in the law, it's a related concept to statute of limitations. It's common law idea of laches, meaning, listen, if you wait too long to pursue a claim, there's an inherent unfairness because evidence hasn't been preserved. There are witnesses are dead, are gone, that sort of thing. That after the passage of time, how can for example, if you're a Catholic diocese and someone brings suit, let's say they expand at the age of 50, there'd be a good likelihood that the priest who actually committed those crimes, the people who were in the administrative capacity that may have covered it up, are all dead and gone.
Yeah,
Um,
I wanted to ask you about that. Yeah.
and yet, here's the thing: to a jury, they would still say, "Well, look, hey, let's give this guy some money." I mean, and to me, there's an inherent unfairness there. Um, uh,
But let me ask you that, because if I understand, and you'll know a lot more about this than I will, but
I will.
now in in civil cases, right, you have to prove your case through a preponderance of the evidence. Is that the typical standard? Am I
Correct.
right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
it would seem to me that if you don't have witnesses and things like that, because they're dead and evidence hasn't been preserved, it would actually make it more difficult for the people making that claim to meet that standard. Or
Well, I
am
don't
I
think
am
so.
I
No. Yeah. No. I mean, the difficulty would be the victim would still be able to put on evidence and say, "Hi, I was abused, and here were the circumstances, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened." And you turn to the defense and you say, "What do you have to say to that?" And they say, "Well, we can't produce the priest who says it didn't happen. We can't produce these other folks. We don't have any records going back that far." Um, and the jury could well look at it as well. What evidence did I see? I heard from this guy who said he was abused. No one contradicted that.
okay? And that's enough. I mean,
verdict for plaintiff.
that's enough
Yeah,
for a legal standard for that sort of thing to be okay.
yeah, oh yeah.
That seems messed up. So okay, that helps
I
actually.
mean, look, no, here it comes down to the jury would be the finder of fact,
Mhm.
and if they believed the witness, right? I mean, if they think, look, this guy's being truthful, um, he says he was abused. There's nothing that's been put on to suggest that he wasn't. That's absolutely meets preponderance of evidence.
So then it would be different than if we looked at it from a criminal standpoint, because the standard is raised considerably, and then it
Correct.
would be a lot harder to do beyond a reasonable doubt, essentially.
Right. The burden is on the state to prove certain elements of a crime, and those elements are often, again, there's a mens rea component that you do it knowingly or intentionally. There may be other aggravating or mitigating factors that, depending on the statute that you're looking at, they have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. It's sort of a whole laundry list. And in the civil case, it's really, if you're just talking about a civil tort, um,
I see
it's
what
a
you're
lot
saying.
easier. Yeah.
And I guess part of the problem is that in a criminal case, you would have to charge you would have to charge individuals, and they could
Correct.
be dead. And in a civil case, of course, the institution goes on indefinitely, and so you can get some kind of compensation. Whereas if
Yep.
some priest or bishop who took part of a cover up, if they're dead, then it's not like you can do anything to them, and you can't do anything to the church itself or the
Right.
diocese
As a
itself. Is that
corporate
right?
entity.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, and I guess it just, when I looked at some of the numbers, though, I could see why people want to do something, because this investigation was only covered 6 of the 7 dioceses in one state. I mean, there are 145 Catholic Church dioceses in the United States. Now, of course, there's no way to know the scope of all this, but if there were, conservatively, 1,000 victims in 6 dioceses, and you consider that there are 145 dioceses, I mean, again, the potential number of victims and predator priests is really just staggering. I mean, it just, the whole thing makes me sick, and it just seems like one of these situations where we obviously want to do something, and I would certainly love to see investigations like this in every state. And I don't know if that's going to happen, but I think it's certainly something that should happen, because I think
Well,
I would be stunned if every state that did an investigation did like this didn't find similar type things.
Well, something that could be done that would deal with this is if the church could again create its own system for compensating folks. I mean, they could set aside a victims compensation fund and do this privately and sort of essentially waive the statute of limitations for certain folks and set up some sort of a procedure. By which people could be compensated. Now, I don't know whether they'll do that or not, or that's sort of a big question, and they don't have to do a lot of wrestling with this based on again, their finances and the moral obligation to do the right thing, as well as the moral obligation to make sure that um, claims they're paying are correctly being paid. So
Well, and this
I
is
don't know, but that would be, but this kind of goes back to, I just wanted to, there's a little bit of a parallel between what we're just talking about um, with Trump and the intelligence community, and also with Strzok and with the FBI, that the culture of institutions matters,
yeah, absolutely.
and I think that just kind of is,
Yeah. Yeah, I think the best thing that could happen would be grand jury reports in 49 more states, and the church being just essentially rocked to its core, because as you know, culture is an extraordinarily difficult thing to change, and
yeah,
it can take a cataclysm to change a culture. And I think if it's something just like one individual state, that's not going to be enough. I think it needs to just be something that just totally devastates the church, so it can be rebuilt as an organization that doesn't have such just an egregious moral failing, moral rot at so I hope to see that. But we'll see what kind of what happens as a result of this. All right, well, finally this week, let's talk about a just a good old fashioned policy story. I'd like to
all
get
right,
away from some of this just
more
incredibly
lurid
sad
stuff,
stuff.
yeah.
Yeah, well, it's just heartbreaking too. Anyway, this week, Education Secretary Betsy DeVos announced plans to rescind a regulation that currently requires for-profit colleges to prove that the students they enroll can get decent-paying jobs. So it's called the Gainful Employment Rule, and it was enacted during the Obama administration after a large number of for-profit higher education institutions were involved in scandals. Basically, they involved schools that more or less set up to defraud students and, rake in a lot of federal aid that the students had received, giving them basically a worthless education in return. And since 2010, almost half of it was 2,000 for-profit schools, about half of them have closed, and their student population has declined by about 1.6 million. And there is a general agreement, even in the for-profit education sector, that these rules did have their intended effect of driving out the worst actors, the most
The bad
fraudulent
apples,
schools,
yeah.
like, say, Trump University, which was in existence from, I believe, 2005 till 2010. Now, the department says it plans to update its college scores card website to provide more accurate data about student debt, earnings after graduation, completion rates, program costs, things like that, for both for-profit and nonprofit schools. So I think the argument here is that schools shouldn't be targeted based on their for-profit status, and that providing more information should be enough of a safeguard here, they think. So Jay, what do you
Yeah.
think about this proposal?
No, I think that's right. I think if it's good for the goose, good for the gander. The issue that the regulation applies only to for-profit schools, I find to be sort of troubling. Again, that's not to say that there weren't plenty of bad actors out there in the for-profit world, but there was a lawsuit a couple years ago about law schools. Again, these are prestigious nonprofit, established law schools, and essentially inflating their employment numbers that they report, and folks, taking on again a whole lot of debt under the assumption that look, this percentage of people find jobs so many years out, and it's at this and this salary, so yeah, I'll take on that debt. So I think if you're going to do this kind of reporting, and I'm a little bit on the fence about whether this is something the government really needs to be involved in, or whether it's something that well, I don't know.
You mean reporting?
Organizations could do it by themselves, or let sort of the private sector, the marketplace, sort of sort this out. But if the government is going to weigh in, I think it ought to be a fair across the board reporting.
Well, I think the market has totally failed to do this on its own, and for good reason, understandably so. It's difficult to make a profit doing that sort of thing. So I think this is one of these instances where there's no good market incentive to create a comprehensive comparison site that's essentially free, for everyone to
Oh, but
use. And
no, but
so,
look at all
well,
like
I'm not.
the
Well,
U.S. News and World Report rankings
that's
and
a
the Barron's
that's a
rankings and
totally
all
different
those
thing.
things.
No, that's a
Yeah,
totally different thing, Jay. And that's voluntary reporting, and those rankings are ridiculous for so many reasons.
they
The reason
are.
we
Yeah.
have a college scorecard is because the market has failed repeatedly to do this, and there are just something. And that's not to
Well, and
blame the
I
market.
would say, yeah, to some extent,
It,
it's the dishonest reporting.
well, yeah, and that's just to say that there are certain things that markets just inherently don't do well. Certain goods they don't provide. Certain what are called public goods. Markets aren't set up to provide them. In this case, I would argue this is a public good, but that's a secondary issue. I would say that I totally disagree with you about the elimination of the gainful employment rule being a good idea. And in part, it makes me think about the reference to the Voting Rights Act and what's called, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, and many listeners maybe too, this idea of pre-clearance. And it used to be,
Right.
up until very recently,
Certain southern states.
right, had to get approval or pre-clearance before they changed some of their voting laws. And the reason why it particularly applied to these states is because they had shown a strong pattern of discrimination against minority groups in the past. And so to me, I understand the fundamental logic of it should be the same for everyone. But the fact of the matter, and we've talked about this in other contexts, when it comes to laws and regulations, one size does not fit all. Just like with Dodd-Frank, I argued that, Dodd-Frank was in many ways, as it was originally set up, was unfair to small community banks. And I was actually in favor of some of those loosening of regulations for those banks for a lot of
And you were
reasons.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I was right. And I think it's the same thing here. So I think certainly that given what we've seen about so much bad behavior in the very recent past, that this still makes a lot of sense. Now, I know it doesn't seem that way to Betsy DeVos, who's devoted, much of her personal fortune to pushing for-profit higher education, and all of the for-profit higher education people she brought into the education department. So, of course, they're going to see things that way, and they are entirely wrong about this.
Okay. This to me, and I would say, arguing the other side, is one of those examples of regulations setting up where it's a barrier to entry of other competitors, and I think that's sort of the argument of, look, there's the traditional college system that we've got has a whole lot of problems, that it's outrageously expensive. It keeps getting more and more expensive. We could do a whole show on why. And the results, it turns out, seem to be less and less, appealing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we seem to have people with fewer skills, fewer marketable skills, fewer critical thinking skills. That what you're paying more and getting less. Um, For-profit colleges sort of arrived on the scene, offering a primarily vocational type program. That may be good, that may be bad, but to me, having the government again step in and again sort of set barriers to entry to the market this is the type of regulation that I often complain about. That and again, that's not to say all the for-profit colleges are good or bad. Some of them were absolutely terrible.
More than some. I mean, this
Okay.
isn't like a few bad apples. And I understand your argument about barriers to entry, and as a general rule, I agree with it. But there are certain instances in which barriers to entry are a good thing. Like for, say, your surgeon. You want there to be a pretty
Sure.
high barrier. And I would say this is one of these cases where you're asking someone to devote 2, 3, 4 or more years of their life, tens of thousands of dollars, if not more, to this endeavor. Well, I think it's reasonable to make sure that, at least to put in some safeguards to ensure that people aren't being bilked. And we have a lot more safeguards when it comes to nonprofit higher education on this. There are
Sure.
regional accreditors and all sorts of other things, and we don't have that structure set up for profit. It was just kind of like a Wild West thing, or it was. And so I think there need to be barriers to entry here, given what's at stake.
And you know what? That's a fair point. But I would say, let's make those barriers to entry applicable to everyone. Now, again, you mentioned the surgeon idea, right? But you would oppose, one set of regulations for a surgeon who works for a nonprofit organization, hospital, and another who works for a for-profit.
Yeah, I see your point.
Right? I mean, I'm just saying it ought to be an objective standard, and let's do it across the board.
Well, I see what you're saying, and I would change the frame of reference on that. If that were the only thing, if it were only the profit or nonprofit designation, I would totally agree with you. But I look at patterns of past behavior. So to me, the analogy would be more not a surgeon working for a for-profit or nonprofit, but a surgeon who's had a record of botched surgeries in the past and someone who's had a much better record. And so you put people on probation and that sort of thing.
All right.
So
fair enough.
All right. Well, there you go. I think that about does it for this week's show. But before we go, I want to let everyone know that as soon as Jay and I are done recording this show, we're going to be doing our special supporters exclusive bonus after show. And I think this week, maybe we'll talk a little bit about Omarosa's new book and President Trump and the N-word and, taping conversations in the Situation Room. Wow. Non-disclosure agreements. And also, if we have time, I'd love to get into these group of former Detroit school kids who are actually suing in federal court because they argue their education was so bad they believed it violated one of their fundamental constitutional rights. And I'm sure Jay has some interesting stuff.
That?
Well, we'll get into that, certainly. Yeah. So if you're a supporter, that will be waiting for you. It should be by the time you hear this. I'm doing my job right. And if you're not a supporter and you'd like to check it out, again, just go to politicsguys.com/support or just go to politicsguys.com and click on support the show or the Patreon or PayPal links, and we will get you set up and you can be listening to our bonus show. But that is it for this episode. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We do hope you like what you heard. And if you haven't already subscribed to the show, that is a huge help. So if you could do that, as well as sharing episodes with your friends, enemies, colleagues, what have you. And it's generally really easy to do right in your podcast app. Also, if you could leave reviews and ratings of the show on iTunes, that helps as well. And if you want to get in touch with us, you can do that by mailing us at mail@politicsguys.com. There's also our Facebook page where you can message us when we post stuff throughout the week. That's facebook.com/politicsguys page. And we're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you join us.